This is Street Knowledge with Chris Graham.
Welcome to the podcast. Chris Graham and Scott German. It's a Monday, and we're going to talk some UVA sports, some Baltimore Orioles, some Washington Capitals here in the podcast. We'll start where we're most comfortable. The wheelhouse is UVA sports. We're going to talk. We talked so much football last week. We'll talk about the good sport. We'll talk about men's basketball and some news that popped up just late last week on Friday. A flurry of news reports, nothing really updated since then, about Braxton Key, the Alabama transfer. He's a sophomore. Most, of course, folks who transfer in without any kind of a graduate, with a degree, that kind of thing, you got to sit out that year. We've had transfers in the past. A significant one, Anthony Gill, a few years ago, transferred in from South Carolina, had to sit out his year. You wait your year out, then you come in. In Key's case, he has 2 years of eligibility left. Well, the news from last Friday, is that UVA apparently is putting together a process to appeal for immediate eligibility. Apparently, without a lot of detail that I've seen, at least, maybe a family member who would if Key were to sit out that year, might not be able to see him play. Maybe someone who's got a terminal illness. The details are kind of sparse on that, but how interesting it would be. We've seen cases. The NCAA actually, Scott, has approved cases of this nature in the past. So, UVA might, if Key certainly is eligible, that's huge news for UVA basketball.
It is, and we talked about if he is awarded instant eligibility, you got a strong case for Virginia maybe opening the season as preseason number one, because he's that kind of player. He's a dynamic player, and you add him to the mix of what's already there. You're just increasing the depth. You're increasing scoring across the court. It's potentially huge as far as the preseason predictions, because I think that it would certainly warrant Virginia really being considered maybe a number one team. But you look at it, there is a precedent for this. We talked about it. We thought there might even be a link to where I think maybe 7-8 years ago, Phillip Simms of Alabama transferred to Virginia, instantly eligible for similar situations because of a serious injury, illness in the family, something like this. I'm not quite sure, but I'm sure our listeners can Google that. Correct us if they're wrong, but I'm all for it. I think it would be great, because I'm guilty of anyone who wanted to see instant gratification. But I'm a little concerned that would it potentially maybe mix? Would it have some adverse effect on the chemistry of the team, the mix of the chemistry? Because we saw it in Anthony Gill, who did sit out a year, and when he was eligible, he didn't get on the court and get a lot of playing time until he sort of mastered Tony's defense. What's there to expect Key to come in here and right off the get-go be able to play when it took Gill a year of redshirting and then about a month and a half or so of the season to get playing time? You think that is something to be worried about?
It could be. We talked about that when we talked about Key transferring in, and you see this all the time with Tony Bennett. When you talked about Gill there, another side of that coin could be the experience with Nigel Johnson this past year. Johnson, as a grad transfer, he was eligible immediately, and a guy who had put up some really good numbers at Rutgers, particularly the year before, and when his redshirt junior season, he had some shining moments for Virginia, but Johnson didn't really see on a consistent basis. He wasn't able to really consistently produce for Virginia last year because you could see it. Those of us who watched the program on a regular basis could see that he'd be out of position defensively. Maybe not totally bought into the offense, and that was even late in the season the case with Johnson. And And so it could be an issue. I would think that, with Key, if he were immediately eligible, you don't see him start. I really don't think you see him start. I think that maybe what he does, he's a rotation guy, no question. With his talent, he's not going to sit on the bench for and use eligibility up and then only have the 1 year left and really not play a lot next year. If he's eligible this coming season, he's going to be a depth guy for this team. I still think you have obviously you have Ty Jerome and Kyle Guy in the backcourt. You've got Jack Salt at center. The question is where DeAndre Hunter plays, whether it's the 3 or the 4. Then Mamadi Diakite maybe is the starter. Perhaps maybe Key is the first big guy off the bench. He's 6'8". He's more of an inside player. He's more of a post player for this team. Maybe your best lineup though becomes he playing the 4 and DeAndre Hunter playing the 3. But I think he's a guy that would give you, if he is eligible next year, I think he's a guy that probably gives you 18 to 22 minutes a game, kind of like what DeAndre Hunter gave Virginia this year. And then his senior season at Virginia, which would if he's eligible next year, it will be 2 years from now. I mean, we presume DeAndre Hunter is probably only he's only going to stay 1 more year at Virginia, go pro. He could have easily gone pro this past year. And being the current draft situation, I think Key then becomes a starter on that 2019-2020 team. So I mean, yeah, you're trading. What you're trading there is, I mean, if he sits out this year, then you probably have him as a starter for 2 years. If he plays this year, he's probably again he's more of a 6-man, and then starting in his 2019-2020 season. But then so that's a trade-off. You get 2 years. Either he's a reserve for a year and a starter for a year, or he's a starter for 2 years. But the other side of that is, again, if he's part of this mix and he's part of our 8 or 9-man rotation next year, I agree with you, Scott. I think Virginia is the favorite in the ACC. They're one of the top 2 or 3 favorites across the country to win the national championship. So those are the stakes there, I guess.
And you got to hand. You have to just trust that the coaching staff has already evaluated that. They've already gotten to know him well enough. They've watched him play. They've got film of him, and I don't believe there would be anyone pushing this if that was a concern. And I think you have to, if you can get him eligible for next season, then that's super because Tony's recruited. It kind of falls in that he plays next year. We anticipate losing DeAndre Hunter the following season. So yeah, I'm all for it. And boy, I tell you what, it's going to be. It may make a long football season go by pretty quickly.
Yeah, and it's something I've been saying as we've been doing our postseason podcast dating back to the end of March. When you analyze this roster again, what DeAndre Hunter gives you, he gives you so much flexibility. He can play the backcourt or the front court, and he's a stretch 4 that nobody can guard, and he's also a big guard that the little guys who have to guard him on the perimeter can't keep up with, and he's such a defensive presence that it's his flexibility talent-wise that makes this Virginia team next year so difficult. And the one small weakness, and it's this very small weakness in the roster that I see, is just that depth. We talk about how Marco Anthony maybe steps up. There's other guys that you can look at to step up. I thought I'd mention this too. I think in the context of this, it's pretty interesting to bring up just sort of what Francisco Cafaro has been able to do. I don't know if for folks who are out there following, especially Twitter and really keeping up with the recruits that are out there. Francisco Cafaro, the 7-footer from Argentina that signed with Virginia, he'll be a freshman this coming season, and kind of came out of nowhere, under the radar as a recruit. Very late addition to the recruiting class for next year. And Cafaro, he was someone as an international player, not even rated as a recruit. We talk about 2-star recruits, 3-star recruits, 4-star recruits, whatever. He didn't get a rating because the recruiting services hadn't seen him play enough. Well, he played in the FIBA Under-17 America's Championship that was over the last couple of weeks. He played for the Argentina team, and he ended up making the all-tournament team, and now he's a 4-star recruit all of a sudden. He had in the team's 104-92 loss to the U.S. last week. He had 22 points, 6 of 9 shooting. He was 10 of 12 from the foul line. having seen some clips of him. Of course, clips are what they are, but you see clips of him. He's a 7-footer who can shoot from the outside, drive to the basket, post up. He's a defensive presence. So Cafaro might be a guy too that steps in. We often will write off freshmen being a major part of a Tony Bennett team, especially a veteran-laden Tony Bennett team like we're going to see next year. But what we saw talent-wise out of Cafaro in this U17 America's Championship, it might be hard to keep him off the court next year. So, the area that I thought might be the slight weakness for this team, depth, particularly in the front court, might become a strength all of a sudden. Cafaro and what he might be able to do, and then certainly if Braxton Key is available, this team might be loaded in the front court, which, it's going to be hard to keep this team, out of those top 5 rankings if that's the case.
And as we, talked about earlier in the podcast, just because the record may not be as glitzy as last year's record doesn't mean that the team isn't as good. And we found out, unfortunately, tragically, that what you do in the regular season, what you do in the ACC tournament doesn't always transition to what happens in the NCAA tournament. So, that's kind of preparing fans for is that, we may not complete an undefeated road season in the ACC, but it still may, at the end of the year, may be just as good, if not a better team than what we took into postseason last year.
I got to do this while we were talking about the fact that Braxton Key is a transfer from Alabama, that Virginia is applying for this hardship waiver to become eligible immediately. We mentioned Phillip Simms, who also, as it turns out, transferred from Alabama back in 2012, as it turns out. And we talked about the chemistry issues that could exist. I mean, you bring a guy in quickly and try to play him. Well, I got to bring this up, Scott, because, we're honest people here at Augusta Free Press on our podcast here. Phillip Simms transferred in. I remember that year. He was a heralded recruit. He was a 5-star quarterback. He was from Virginia. He went to Alabama. He was holding the clipboard there for a couple of years because Alabama's Alabama. But that spring football game, actually, that year, I remember his numbers were something like 9 for 12 for 200 yards and 4 or 5 touchdowns, whatever it was, against Alabama. And then he transferred out, the medical hardship issue kind of thing. So that was, I got to say it this way, that was sort of the beginning of the end of the Mike London era. The 2011 team, of course, had gone to the bowl game, the Peach Bowl. And Michael Rocco had been the quarterback that led that Virginia team to the Peach Bowl. That 2011 team had we were playing Virginia Tech in Charlottesville. The winner gets to play in the ACC championship game that year. We go from that to London not being able to decide who to start between Phillip Simms and Michael Rocco. Simms, the 5-star quarterback from Alabama. Rocco, a guy who was recruited to be a backup and ended up starting and playing well. And, that didn't work out so well chemistry-wise for that team. So we'll hope that if this all goes through, that we'll have a better sort of end scenario than we saw with that one.
Yeah, that was one of the early London disasters as to, I had thoughts about that from the very get-go, but, this is a little different situation, different personnel, so I have all hopes that this works out much, much better than Phillip Simms' transfer.
And I'm going to mention something else here. We're going to talk about Chris Davis Berry Trotz coming up here later in the podcast. But Scott, you warned me the other day. We got together for dinner the other night, and our podcast last week we talked about the Bronco Mendenhall Say the program, and I won't go too much more into that. But I thought you told me don't look at the message boards, Chris. You won't like them. Well, so of course when you tell a person not to look at something, it's kind of like when you're driving down the road and you tell a person don't look over there at that car wreck. You look at the car wreck. So I got back home that night from dinner, and Scott, I looked at the message board, and it wasn't as bad as I guess I presumed. Folks who weighed in on our thoughts, my thoughts particularly on the Mendenhall Say the program. But one stuck out, just jumped out at me. One of the many posts on that thread. And again, it was probably 50-50, maybe even slightly leaning in the direction of, hey, those guys actually are onto something here. But one guy posted it. Scott, I got to get your reaction. I'm not sure if you looked at it chapter and verse like I did. Okay, so there was one poster who said, okay, the 3 worst sports writers covering UVA sports. 1, Sam Bloom. 2, Chris Graham. 3, Doug Dowdy. How do I beat Doug Dowdy? Scott? How am I worse than Doug Dowdy? And Doug, Doug's Doug. He's a Hall of Famer. He got into Sports Hall of Fame. But I pointed out, I guess I kind of snarkily pointed out, Scott, that I didn't ask anybody about being a 1 losing to a 16. So, that's pretty good company, I guess. If people are going to hate, I'm up there with the best.
I did read that, and I was that kind of puzzled me as well because boy, that's either setting the bench real high or the bench real low, depending upon the perspective, I guess. But maybe that anonymous poster, I don't know, but Chris, maybe he saw you kick a dog one time.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Or do something to antagonize a cat or something like that. I'm not sure, but
I'll tell you, I was offended. Here's where
Dowdy, unless they completely went into a bubble immediately after the horn sounded on the UMBC game, and didn't listen to or read any news articles and understand the absolutely horrendous, insensitive question that Doug asked one of the UVA players, Jerome, was it?
It was Ty Jerome, yeah,
Ty Jerome, about that. So, to me, that would put him in that number 1 position for eternity.
Well, and I'll say it this way: I'm kind of offended that if you're going to make this kind of list up and put me ahead of Dowdy, this Sam Bloom kid. I wrote a column about this, just having some fun with it the other day. I've got an intramural a championship shirt for when I won the free throw competition at UVA as a 4th year, older than Sam Bloom. The kid is barely out of college. He hasn't done nearly enough to be number 1 ahead of me. If this is your rendering of things, if I'm ahead of Dowdy, boy, Sam Bloom's got no chance. I mean, he's just a beat writer. He doesn't get to opine on things. He's I've also noticed. I mean, yeah, there were lots of people who were pointing out lots of things that we talked about, and it started a really interesting discussion on the Sabre message board. And I'm actually kind of happy for Chris Wright over at the Sabre. Good friend of mine. I love Chris a lot. We talk when we during the season. We talk a lot about different things, including a lot of non-sports things. And I was happy to help generate some traffic for him because there was a long thread that kind of got away at different points. It got away from just bashing Chris and Scott, mostly me, and talking about the issues, which was actually that's kind of what you do this stuff for. You do the podcast, you do the columns, you get people to talk about the various issues. But of course, people had to take, in 2013, he raised issue with Tony Bennett and all the transfers. And I did. And I'll still defend that. I still didn't like the flow of transfers out of the program back in that day and age. And glad that it turned around and glad guys aren't, jumping out and maybe affecting the reputation of UVA's results. I got a degree on the wall that kind of is impacted by whether or not we graduate kids on a regular basis. But I noticed nobody said, so I got it wrong in 2013, but I noticed nobody said, Scott, that I got it wrong last year too, because we talked a lot of podcasts. I wrote a preseason column before the basketball season last year. Back when Virginia was picked 6th in the ACC and nobody had Virginia in the top 25, I said, I look at this roster and I see a Final Four team. Well, I was wrong about that, Scott. We didn't go to the Final Four last year, but nobody pointed that out. I got that wrong. In fact, I was more wrong about that than I've been wrong about anything. And nobody pointed that out. So, I guess maybe I gave them more ammunition there. If they're listening, if folks are listening now, you want to point that out and have some more fun with me, I guess you can probably do that.
Yeah, and I'll be the first to defend you on the 2013, and you weren't the only one that was questioning. Questioning the direction of the program. I don't know if we could, but I bet if you could go back to that archive you wanted to, I know that there was a lot of posters, a lot of concern about just what direction the program was going in. We were having kids transfer out. We went down to Tennessee in the December part of our schedule and just got absolutely embarrassed in Knoxville. And, it wasn't like you were the only one raising some question. I think it was deserved. But, I think any fan base, you're going to have fans that are going to absolutely, whatever your opinion, if it's not a 100% supporting the local guys, then your opinion's wrong. You're an idiot. You're a terrible writer. You're a terrible human being. Whatever. We're as big as fans as you will find. But I believe we also try to look at things objectively. And I think that if you look back on our takes on the Mendenhall situation, for the most part, we agreed with his state of the program assessment. We just kind of thought that it was maybe a much better way of doing it. So we'll see. We'll see if we were right. I hope we're wrong. I hope that if for whatever reason that he decided to choose that type of approach to address the Board of Registers, I hope that things, we have a 6 or 7 win season, we start recruiting better, and maybe people look back and say, he got people's, because that DOV meeting got the right people's attention. And, funding for the program needs to be increased. They need to go ahead and continue moving through with the support building. I just don't agree with the way he did it, but he's a coach. He's making $3 million a year, so he's entitled to taking whatever approach he wants to deliver the message. So we'll see. We'll just have to see. But I don't think because we disagree with it, it makes us or makes you a bad writer or not a fan, not someone wanting to see the program succeed. I think it just makes you a realist. You're just calling it the way you see it.
A note to our listeners. So this is actually where we lose Scott for the rest of the podcast. Unexpected situation popped up as we were recording. So that was our UVA sports talk anyway. We talked earlier in the podcast a couple different times about how we're going to talk Washington Capitals and Baltimore Orioles news. I will go into the Caps news. I want to save the O's discussion, Scott being the O's, the resident O's radio blogger for us here, for him to get some input on the Chris Davis benching situation from Baltimore. So we'll talk about that another day this week with Scott. But wanted to get into the last bit of news for our podcast today, and then we'll break off Barry Trotz's news. And Barry Trotz, as we were getting ready to start recording our podcast, the word came down that Trotz was resigning as the head coach of the Washington Capitals. 11 days ago, he was holding the Stanley Cup over his head in Vegas, but the Caps and Trotz not able to come to terms, as it turns out, on an extension. And Trotz, in 4 years at Washington, a 205 and 89 record, best in the NHL over that period of time. And his contract actually included an automatic 2-year extension if he won the Stanley Cup. But that negotiated rate from back in 2014 when he took the job with the Caps, below market value now, as NHL coaches' salaries have sort of seen a bit of a boost here in the last couple of years. So he had sought to have that improved, and the Caps just not able to come to his terms. And we don't know, as I'm recording this podcast, we don't know how far apart they were. Trotz was making $1.5 million a year, which is that's surprisingly low for a major sports head coach of a successful team at that. So Trotz is no longer the coach of the Washington Capitals. Free agent, he'll command top dollar on the market. He was able to take a snake-bitten franchise to the promised land, and so I'm sure that will certainly be something that will make him very valuable on that job market. And also for Caps fans, hey, you barely are done celebrating the championship, and it was less than a week ago that the streets of DC were taken over by the victory parade, and I wrote a quick news blurb about this and kind of joked that Alex Ovechkin is probably still taking keg stands out of the Stanley Cup, and already the coach is gone. So that will, there's some time. I think training camps start second week of September, so still that's 3 months away. A little bit of time for the Caps to find a new coach and develop the new chemistry they'll need. Certainly a lot of guys on the four lines coming back, and the Capitals will no doubt be one of the favorites heading into the 2018-2019 season to, in their case, repeat as Stanley Cup champions. But it's just not the kind of news you want. Still in the glow of winning your first Stanley Cup, that your coach who wants to be your coach is leaving over money issues, and it appears, at least at this stage, that those money issues are money issues related to the franchise being a little tight with the money. You want to see them spend a little bit more to keep that Stanley Cup mojo going. So but that's not the case in DC, as Barry Trotz is out. So we promised Chris Davis. I didn't include that in the post they ended up on iTunes or on Podbean or on our website, because I knew that before I had a chance to post the podcast, that we weren't going to be able to get there. So if you're confused as you listen through, sorry for that. We just weren't able to get that. Something popped up for Scott as we were finishing up our discussion of UVA sports, and he just wasn't able to help finish out the podcast here. And I really want to get Scott's input on the Chris Davis news. In fact, I'll probably pull together some Chris Davis numbers I had up here on my computer screen to discuss with him as we were breaking down just how anemic Chris Davis had been this year. And we'll put that all down, and we'll get to that later this week. But also I want to emphasize, I was trying to have some fun there with the talk about how I looked at the message boards. It's all in good fun. I would assume that the Bronco Mendenhall defenders out there would agree with this statement. I would assume so, because his whole take was there's more to life than football. There's more to life than football. There's certainly more to life than UVA football. Our program hasn't done well in a long time. Now, there's not a lot more to life than UVA basketball, so that's why we talked UVA basketball so much today. The big news with Braxton Key, whatever it ends up being, we'll end up seeing about that too. But I want to thank you for listening to the podcast today. And we got coming up this week, I'll have Rod Mullins. We'll talk some NASCAR and NHRA from Thunder Valley. You might have followed some of Rod's posts from the Thunder Valley Nationals this past weekend NHRA event. He covered that from Friday through the weekend in depth. We'll talk some World Cup soccer with Seth Megaton, as we've already had a couple of major upsets in the group play. Mexico upsetting Germany in the defending champs opener. That was on Sunday, and a draw as an upset, I guess, Argentina and Iceland. So that was some big news too. So I hope I had that one right. As I'm just mentally going through the checklist of the podcast we have coming up this week, I'll talk some wrestling this week as well. We'll in the aftermath of Money in the Bank, we'll kind of see where things are headed towards SummerSlam as far as that goes. Also, pairings for the G1 Climax tournament from New Japan are out, and it's exciting. We're going to get an Omega Ibushi match coming up at the G1 Climax. So, get your get that New Japan app ready to watch some classic wrestling coming up the next few weeks from New Japan. We'll break that down, and I'm sure Scott and I will have some more UVA news to talk about as well. So a lot of good stuff coming up on the podcast this week. I want to thank you once again for listening, and I always sign off this way. I'm going to continue to do so as we break away from the podcast today. Wahoo wah.